Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Thank you to those of you joining us on YouTube, as this is our first Zoom episode. And thank you to all of our regular listeners and new listeners who find us wherever you get our podcast. On today's episode, my guest is Ilya Somin. He's a professor of constitutional law at the Antonin Scalia School of Law, part of George Mason University. And we're talking about what Professor Somin calls the most sweeping ban on immigration in all of American history, passed by President Trump by executive order, claiming that he needs to protect the country and protect the economy by a complete and total ban on legal immigration to the country. This has a policy and a plan that is going to affect millions of people, that has the potential to hurt the economy by keeping out people with scientific, technology, and other innovative skills and backgrounds, and just plain doesn't make sense from a constitutional standpoint, though it makes sense from a political standpoint from the president who's made immigration his signature issue all the way going back to 2016. Professor Somin dissects the rationale for this policy, helps us understand why it is flawed, and why we should be very concerned about what the president is doing, once again, with an immigration ban. So stay tuned for an important conversation. Everybody stay safe, wear your mask, and be careful. Enjoy this next episode of Good Law, Bad Law. When it comes to the coronavirus, a lot of attention is focused on what our president has not been doing, not wearing a mask, not speaking forcefully to encourage people to social distance, generally not taking it as seriously as many think he should. But my guest today is focusing on something the president is doing, a very strong and controversial move to, in effect, enact what my guest calls the most sweeping ban on immigration in American history. So first of all, Professor Ilya Somin, welcome, and thank you for being on Good Law, Bad Law with me today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Ilya is a professor at George Mason University, the Antonin Scalia Law School, teaching constitutional law, author of the just published book, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom, and the author of the article we're going to talk about that appeared just a few days ago in The Atlantic, entitled The Danger of America's Coronavirus Immigration Bans. So tell us about what President Trump has done to, as you put it, enact the most sweeping ban on immigration in all of American history.
Sure. Initially, back in April, what he did is that for 60 days, he banned the entry of nearly all people seeking permanent residency, what is often called the green card, with just a few exemptions for relatives of U.S. citizens. Now about 10, 12 days ago, he extended that till the end of the year. In addition, he suspended the issuance of numerous temporary work visas, such as H-1B visas and others. And in combination, this is the most sweeping restriction on immigration in all American history. Never in American history has immigration been so completely closed to people seeking to make America their permanent home. It is true, you could say it's just temporary, but the president's advisors, including his top immigration advisor, Stephen Miller, have made clear that they would like to extend these measures further. And the same legal logic that allows it to be extended to the end of the year would almost certainly enable him to extend it later, unless either Trump loses the presidential election or courts show some backbone and strike this down.
And I want to get to the rationales that are being offered for this extremely broad, sweepingly broad move against immigration into the country and your responses to those claimed rationales for it. But when you say that this is a move that is broader than any immigration ban we've seen in our entire country's history, you mentioned some other moments in history where we've faced great challenges and threats to the country, the Great Depression, World War II, even the Great Flu pandemic of the early part of the 20th century. How are you comparing what Trump is doing now to those points in history and attempts to limit immigration during those periods of time?
Yeah. So at none of those times did the U.S. ban virtually all entry by people seeking permanent residency, other than some close immediate relatives of current U.S. citizens, such as spouses, children under the age of 21, and the like. It just didn't happen. Some of those periods actually saw relatively little in the way of new immigration restrictions, including actually the Great Flu pandemic, though some severe immigration restrictions were enacted just a few years afterwards. Others, like the Great Depression and also in World War II and during most of World War I, there were actually relatively few new immigration restrictions enacted. During the Great Depression, we were already under the pretty restrictive 1924 Immigration Act, which up till now may have been the most restrictive in American history, but even that was not as restrictive as what Trump has done.
Okay, so let's there are a couple of rationales that they're being offered for this. Then there's a legal rationale that I know you have a real problem with, and I want to go through all those, and then maybe think about what's really going on here and why is he doing this? Not the first time that the president has taken a bold step against immigration. So we can think about whether this fits into some pattern, maybe even a politically motivated move on his part. But first, there are these two rationales that he's claiming, that the administration is claiming serve as a basis for this move, that you talk about in your article. One is that this is a way to attempt to stem the spread of the coronavirus, and two, that this somehow is going to help our country economically during a time when the pandemic has had a terrible, disastrous impact on our country's economy and on people's ability to keep their jobs in this economy. So tell us, why do you think those are not real bases but are pretext, or if not pretext, why those have no real basis?
Sure. Let's take the first one first, which is the spread of the coronavirus. This rule has been imposed regardless of whether the country the person is coming from actually has more spread than the United States or not. It applies even to countries where there is very little coronavirus, and there's no basis for believing that people coming from areas where the coronavirus is less widespread in the U.S. pose any significant threat beyond what we already have. In addition, it is also the case that it's not even clear that international travel bans do very much to restrict the spread of coronavirus, at least in a country which already has so-called community spread internally. Recent studies suggest that at best, they might slow down the spread by a few days or maybe a couple weeks or the like, so it's a relatively trivial effect. Furthermore, to the extent that it is a problem, I do grant it could be a problem in some cases where somebody's coming from a coronavirus hotbed or the like. There is the obvious alternative of simply imposing a 14-day quarantine, which is what South Korea, one of the countries that has handled coronavirus the best, has done. A 14-day quarantine is a deal breaker for a tourist or somebody on a short business trip or the like, but for an immigrant seeking to make the U.S. their permanent home, it's actually a small price to pay. I would add that the quarantine...
And this is what a lot of states are doing right now, by the way. I mean,
yes, a lot of states have been doing this with internal travel from places like currently Florida as we speak, which have an unusually large outbreak. And again, it's a really tough blow for somebody who's trying to go from Florida to, say, New York for a vacation or something, assuming there are still people doing things like that. But somebody who wants to move to New York permanently, they can do that. And while it's an annoyance, it's not a deal breaker. Right. I would add also that the quarantine approach combined with relative freedom of movement is actually much better than a total exclusion, because a total exclusion simply promotes illegal immigration. And if somebody is here illegally, if they think they have symptoms or get infected, they're going to be very reluctant to turn themselves into public health authorities because they might get deported if the government finds out about them. Moreover, immigration detention centers, which have been filling up more than before as a consequence of this administration's policies. They too, like ordinary prisons, are potential sites for the spread of coronavirus. And of course, if the virus begins to spread there, as there's some evidence it has, maybe in some of these facilities, that it could spread to the outside as well because of contractors, ICE, government officials and the like who work in those places and can take them out into the community. So overall, this is actually doing more to increase the risk of the coronavirus than decrease it. Should I talk about the employment issue next?
Yeah, because I think that only gets to the question of why there isn't an economic basis for a total ban, but the adverse impacts on the economy that actually result when you restrict immigration.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll try to briefly summarize both. So I can certainly understand that there are going to be cases where almost any immigrant, there's some chance they compete with a particular native for a job. But overall, if you look at social science research on this, it overwhelmingly shows that more Americans benefit in terms of their wages from immigration than lose out, and that cutting immigration does not seem to increase natives' wages. This was even true during the Great Depression, when the federal government and states actually deported hundreds of thousands of Mexican laborers. In some cases, they also deported people who were actually U.S. citizens because their procedures were so shoddy. And a recent study by the National Bureau of Economic Research shows that did not actually, even that during the middle of the Great Depression, did not actually increase Americans' wages. It may even have slightly lowered them. That result is not clear whether it lowered them or not, but it certainly failed to increase them and also failed to reduce unemployment among Americans. And the reason for that is interesting. It actually is a couple reasons. One is immigrants contribute to the economy in various ways through innovation, through providing additional productivity and the like, and that benefits natives both as consumers, but also by providing additional job opportunities. Secondly, in much of the time, not all the time, but much of the time, immigrants, instead of being substitutes for native labor, they on average perform slightly different jobs because they have on average somewhat different job skills. And many of those jobs are jobs which there are native workers who, if you have more workers of one type, you have more need for workers of another. A standard example is often given as restaurants, that if there are more waiters available, or if there are more cooks available, then that provides more employment for waiters. And it turns out, for instance, that recent immigrants are often likely to be employed in the back part of a restaurant where language skills are less important, whereas natives are employed in those where they're more important. Finally, I would add that the reason why we have such high unemployment right now is not because there's too much labor, but because some businesses have had to shut down because there's little demand for them due to the coronavirus, others because the government has forced them to shut down. And that's not a problem of too much labor. That's a very different kind of problem. But to the extent that we're excluding immigrants who are productive, particularly immigrants under the so-called H-1B visas, where many of them are entrepreneurs or scientists and the like, providing particularly important services, we will actually slow down the economic recovery rather than increase it. More can be said about this, but even if you believe that there are some particular sectors where you think there's too much labor competition, it certainly doesn't justify a near categorical ban on virtually all migrants seeking permanent residency and a very wide range of temporary work visas as well.
Well, and you have a lot of tech companies that have already been crying in pain over previous bans that have limited people coming into this country who actually bring a lot of skills, who bring science backgrounds, who bring biotech backgrounds, who bring tech backgrounds. And those people, I know there are some limited exemptions to the president's order here, but a lot of people who could be bringing the kind of innovation and enterprise and advancement that we actually need and should value, those people are also going to be kept out by this.
Yeah, I think that's right. And with both H-1B and other visas, the administration already been cracking down in various respects, often not so much by restricting the total number of visas, but by imposing more and more paperwork and regulatory burdens and the like, and doing stuff like making it difficult or impossible for immigrant spouses to be allowed to work in the U.S. So in some ways, what you're seeing is just an extreme extension of their previous policy agenda There's some irony that the administration, they claim to be deregulators, but if you look at the impact of their immigration regulations, even those enacted before coronavirus, by themselves, they impose more burden on the economy than the total amount that has been lifted by anything they've done in terms of deregulation in other areas. So this was already the most regulatory administration in terms of immigration of any, certainly in many decades at the very least. And now it has even more clearly surpassed any possible record in that regard.
Well, that brings me to the next point, actually, jumping off on the idea that the Trump administration claims that they're acting based on a certain ideology. We're deregulators. But in fact, when you look at what they're doing something quite different, if not the exact opposite. Here, it seems pretty ironic to me that one of the big criticisms that Trump and others had of the Obama years was the extent to which Obama turned to executive orders as a way of pushing through initiatives because particularly the Senate and the Congress generally was shutting him down in enacting his agenda. And here's President Trump pursuing the very same strategy as he's done since day one in the White House, executive order after executive order. And I think it takes some explaining why this is a problem, particularly for someone who purports to be guided by conservative principles. The authority or the questions about the authority that any president should have to make this kind of move when arguably it should be Congress making this type of move.
Yeah, so in recent years, presidents of both parties, Bush, Obama, and now Trump, have increasingly turned to executive orders when Congress doesn't want to do what they want, or at least doesn't want to do as much of it and the like. And so this is sort of a problem that in some ways predates Trump. But in the area of immigration, with the coronavirus ban now, Trump has engaged in unilateral executive lawmaking on an even greater scale than anything that was done under Bush and Obama. And those guys obviously were no slouches in that particular department.
Right.
And this is particularly ironic from the standpoint of some conservative jurisprudence and legal scholars and judges and others who have said that this is a real problem. Trump does claim, both with the coronavirus immigration ban and with his previous travel ban orders, that there is legislative authorization. There's a statute called 8 U.S.C. 1182, which dates back to the 1950s, I believe, and which says that the president has the power to exclude the entry of any foreigners who are, quote, detrimental to the interests of the United States. In the travel ban case, the Supreme Court, wrongly in my view, interpreted this to mean that the president can exclude pretty much any foreigner he wants without even necessarily proving that their presence is detrimental to the interest of the United States. He merely has to make some kind of extremely minimally plausible assertion that it might be detrimental. If this is indeed the correct interpretation of the statute, it violates the non-delegation doctrine, the idea that Congress is limited in how much of its legislative power it can delegate to the president. Last year, in an important decision, both conservative and liberal justices said this is a doctrine that's supposed to have some teeth after a long period during which it was enforced very little, if at all. If it's going to have any teeth at all, then surely this interpretation of Section 1182 either renders 1182F unconstitutional, the particular subsection which has this provision, or at the very least, it means the court would need to rethink this very broad interpretation of the section, because essentially if you can exclude any foreigner you want for pretty much any reason, just by making an assertion about U.S. interests without having to prove anything, that's pretty boundless power over in a very important area of law that affects millions of people, both potential migrants, but also Americans, Americans with family abroad, Americans who own businesses, who need additional workers, and so on. So it's about as big a claim of delegated power as could possibly be imagined.
Yeah, and as you say, this isn't something unique to Trump, although he's taken pretty full advantage of. Uh, it seems to me a couple of trends. One is the use of executive orders like this, statutes that are written so broadly and so generally that anything can be defined as in the country's interests. I mean, what is in the national interest? It's so
Sure.
vague. Um, but it also seems that it's that part of what allows a president, whether it's Bush, Obama, or Trump, to uh, to use the power of the executive in what many would regard as legislative ways, executive lawmaking, as you put it, is also Congress's failure to hold on to the power the Constitution gives that body. I mean, I don't hear, and I know there's a lot going on in the world, and maybe this this step that the president took a few days ago is getting lost amid all the other news. But I don't hear anyone in Congress screaming and yelling over the president overreaching in his use of executive authority. Congress doesn't seem to be very interested or able to act to protect the authority the Constitution grants the legislative body. And so presidents are getting away with this because Congress isn't doing anything about it. It seems like that's part of the dysfunction here,
I
constitutional.
think it is part of it. In fairness to Congress, a number of congressional Democrats have introduced bills that would significantly limit Section 1182F. I discussed them in a piece that I did for Forbes 2 or 3 weeks ago. And as a general rule, what to some extent has happened is that when the opposition party controls Congress, they do in fact make noise about executive overreach, as the Democrats are doing under Trump with the House of Representatives, which they control, and the Republicans did under Obama. The difficulty is that the president's own party in Congress, in most cases, will support almost anything he chooses to do, even if it goes against principles that that party itself has often enunciated previously. So even though the opposition party may try to pass legislation to limit the president, it's going to be very difficult to attract enough support from the president's own party in Congress to override a veto. So, for instance, Congress, to its credit, did pass efforts to terminate the president's what I think is bogus national emergency over the building of the border wall. And some Republicans did vote for it in the Senate, a few, enough to get a majority, but not enough to override his veto. And I think this is actually one reason why we do need more judicial enforcement of this, because if there isn't judicial enforcement, then it effectively takes a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress to override presidential excesses. And unfortunately, in a very polarized environment, that will rarely, if ever, happen. The president's own supporters in Congress say, well, you're just attacking the president because you don't like him or because you dislike his tweets or something. While
That
there
hasn't
are
stopped him. But you're right. The back and forth, the debate or taking to the cable shows. I mean, that's not reining him in, and that's not reining in any president these days. You're right. So what exactly do you think the court, and ultimately, of course, we're talking about the Supreme Court because that's where this type of issue will end up. What exactly do you argue the Supreme Court needs to do here?
So I think there are two options. One is they can simply strike down Section 1182F and say that it violates a non-delegation doctrine. There is no precedent preventing this. The travel ban case from 2 years ago, which construed Section 1182F so broadly, it did not consider non-delegation issues. Non-delegation isn't even mentioned in any of the opinions in that case. So that's one option. Not that this would ever happen, but if I were on the Supreme Court, this is what I would vote to do.
And just before we go to the next, just so folks understand what that means. So the Supreme Court would have to hear a challenge to, say, the immigration ban, which the White House, for which the White House relies on this section, this federal statute that allows the president to, in effect, make immigration law immigration law and policy if he deems it in his interest. Again, it's 8 USC section 1182F. And for the Supreme Court to hear a challenge of that based on non-delegation, meaning Congress can't delegate such broad authority that is really lawmaking authority to the executive, and therefore that statute's unconstitutional.
Yeah, that's one option. It's the cleanest and simplest option. By the way, it would not mean the president has no authority to bar entry to anybody. There are other provisions in federal statutes, including other parts of Section 1182, that have more specific grounds for exclusion. There's even a separate federal statute which allows exclusion for people who are bearers of contagious diseases that would be introduced in the United States. But you could strike down Section 1182F. An alternative path is you could construe Section 1182F more narrowly. And that would mean at least partially overruling or revisiting the travel ban case, Trump versus Hawaii. But the court could say, we have this longstanding rule that we construe statutes to avoid constitutional problems where possible. And this is a constitutional problem that was not raised in the previous travel ban case, which, by the way, I think was decided wrongly in various ways, but this particular issue wasn't raised. And therefore, we can construe Section 1182F more narrowly. For example, that its scope is limited by statutes that are enacted later that allow the entry of particular types of people or forbid certain grounds for exclusion and so on. But I think the cleanest solution would be simply to strike down 1182F in its entirety. And if Congress wants to enact additional, more narrowly tailored grounds for excluding people, it can do that. It already has done that actually in some cases. So those options are before it. By the way, the first option of striking it down based on non-delegation, that wouldn't have to be the Supreme Court. Even a lower court can reach that decision because there's no Supreme Court precedent forbidding that. And there is recent Supreme Court precedent from last year strongly suggesting that non-delegation will have at least some real teeth. And as I describe in more detail in my Atlantic article, if it's going to have any significant teeth at all, this particular example is going to be in violation.
Well, so, I mean, what do you think is really going on here, Ilya? Because we're talking about the constitutional aspect of this issue, but I mean, clearly this president has done this before. I mean, you mentioned the travel ban. I mean, within the first days of his presidency, he was issuing executive orders in the first iteration of the travel ban. He certainly was talking about it during his campaigning in 2016. I've always thought that the way that he was pushing the immigration issue, the border wall, Mexico will pay for it, the cheers he got at his rallies and all, that this was very much politically driven. And I know you're thinking it through from the constitutional perspective, but also, I mean, you have paid a lot of attention to this issue. And I was noting in your bio about your new book that you're donating 50% of the royalties from this new book of yours to charities serving refugees. So I think, I hope it's a fair question to ask you, since this is obviously something you care about on a lot of levels. What do you think is really what is driving this? Trump is not really a true conservative in almost any sense. So this is not a true, consistent, ideologically pure conservative, at least in the way he's carrying it out, initiative. So what do you think is really behind this?
So I don't think there's any great mystery about that. Restricting immigration, both legal and illegal, was a central theme of Trump's 2016 campaign. It was one of the major reasons why he won the GOP primaries that year over a large number of candidates, including some fairly strong ones. There is a significant component of the base of the Republican Party, which is very strongly opposed to immigration for a variety of reasons, cultural, in some cases racial, also in many cases the sense that there's a zero-sum game between immigrants and natives. So if immigrants come in and prosper, that means there's less left over for natives. It's very bad economics, but that doesn't mean that there aren't many people who believe it. And Trump's base is those people. He knows that. And he has repeatedly said he's going to do everything he can to try to give those people what they want. And he has, in fact, done that during his administration. I mentioned earlier the earlier travel bans, all the moves to make legal immigration more difficult. There are some people say, well, he was only against illegal immigration. That's can only be believed if you don't pay attention to what he has said and what his leading advisors have said, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, and others. These people have repeatedly said, and Trump himself has also said that he wants to cut legal immigration as well. When this crisis came along, it was a great opportunity from his perspective to do so, and he did it in very much in the tradition of not letting a crisis go to waste. There are other areas where he could have expanded his power where arguably he has not done so, or hasn't done so nearly as much as some people thought that he might. But in this area, he has taken massive advantage of the coronavirus crisis, both with this measure, but also blocking nearly all admission of refugees, asylum applications, and others that I mentioned in the article, but that we haven't had a chance to talk about today. So he has exploited this crisis.
That's all legal immigration. The entire ban that he's putting into place now. In fact,
all of these new rules have to do with legal immigration rather than illegal. And he told us, and his advisor told us repeatedly, that they wanted to massively slash legal immigration. There were some people who just didn't want to believe that that was part of his agenda. It was pretty clear from early on that in fact it was part of it. But perhaps those few people who still think that it's only about illegal immigration, maybe they can wake up and smell the coffee of what's actually going on, and what actually has been going on now for more than 3 years now. So this was part of a pre-existing agenda, and this is sort of the ultimate expression of it that the coronavirus crisis has enabled him to do.
Well, I mean, this affects refugees, asylum seekers, families of people who are already here in this country, and the other categories of people who are being kept out by this now that could really end up hurting the economy, not helping it, as you talk about. And we'll put a link to the article in the description for this episode, Ilya. It's a great piece, really lays out everything that we've talked about here today very concisely and clearly. I encourage everybody to take a look at this and to, not let issues like this that are going to have really huge impact on not only millions of people, but on the millions of the rest of us who really need the type of immigration into the country that the president is striking out against. I agree, for very political reasons. And another issue to pay attention to as we think about the upcoming election. So Ilya Somin, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law and sharing your thoughts about this. Again, we'll share the Atlantic piece, and I'll try to find a link to that Forbes piece as well, so we can include a link to that as well. And a link to your new book, Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom, Oxford University Press, just out. And Ilya will be donating half of the royalties to charity serving refugees. So thank you for that too. And thanks for being on Good Law, Bad Law.
Thank you very much for having me.